Hi, I'm Ken. Let's take a look at my stamp collection. This is my souvenir sheet album. Unfortunately, I don't have this first sheet, the Battle of White Plains. Decent copies sell for around $250, but this one does look good in my collection. This sheet was released in 1926 at the Second International Philatelic Exhibition in New York City as a souvenir. Both this show and the First International Philatelic Exhibition were put on by the American Philatelic Society. The first one was held in 1913, 13 years earlier. There wasn't a souvenir associated with that one, but for the second IPEX, the post office decided to get in on the fun. In 1933, the American Philatelic Society held their convention at the Chicago World's Fair, otherwise known as a Century of Progress International Exposition. This first sheet shows Fort Dearborn, built where Chicago now stands. The second sheet shows the Federal Building Exhibition Hall on the fairgrounds. Together, these two issues actually show a Century of Progress. Below it, I have an unused single and a used single, and also a perforated version from the stamp this was based on. Let me break in for a moment and admit to something. I think I've missed an issue that's associated with this souvenir sheet. As I've been building a new commemorative album to replace my Minuteman album, I've been going through the catalog with a fine-tooth comb, cross-checking that against my Minuteman album, and just making sure that I've accounted for every variant that I wanted to collect. As I've done that, I recognize that this particular single is collectible in two ways. One is as a single cutout of the souvenir sheet, but the other is as a single cutout of something known as a Farley's Follies special printing. That special printing is not released as just one single souvenir sheet, but as a page of 9 of these souvenir sheets. And so the only way to tell the difference between the single cut from the original souvenir sheet and one cut from those special printings is by collecting one of these gutter pairs, as they're called, a pair that has a space in between it that shows that there's actually 2 of these souvenir sheets on the same page. So now that I've recognized those special printings, I need to go find one of them and add them to this page. These special printings came about when the then Postmaster General James Farley had been caught giving special printings of some issues to President Franklin Roosevelt. He was an avid stamp collector. That didn't really bother people. But when Farley got caught giving copies to other VIPs, friends, and some of his family, collectors found out and there was an outcry. To deal with those complaints, Farley ordered similar special issues to be created and released to the general public. These came to be known as Farley's Follies. Some of these special printings are easy to distinguish, like the National Parks issues or the Mothers of America issues, both of which are just imperfect versions of the original. These are included on that special printings page of my Minuteman album. But others are harder to tell apart, like individual imperforate stamps cut from the imperforate souvenir sheets compared to the special printings of those sheets. For those stamps, you need to see the space between the 2 stamps called gutters to be sure you have one of the special printings. These variants were left out of the Minuteman album, presumably because you can't practically collect them as singles. And since some of the special printings need to be collected as pairs, many people collect the whole set as pairs. On the special printings that were not souvenir sheets, some of the pairs on the sheet are separated by a cut line. People collecting these stamps tend to favor copies that show that cut line between the 2 stamps. I looked at some of my duplicates and amazingly found that I had these 2 cut line pairs. These 2 pairs are not ones that are hard to tell apart from the ordinary issues, but collecting them this way tells the story better. I guess we're always learning. This sheet was made for the 1934 National Stamp Exposition in New York City. This show was sponsored by the New York American newspaper for sure, but I found conflicting information about who actually hosted the show. One source I found said it was hosted by the New York Stamp Club and other local clubs, while most others attribute it to the American Philatelic Society. I don't think that's right. The next souvenir sheet is certainly from the American Philatelic Society's convention and show later that year in Atlantic City. The APS website lists the Atlantic City show on its website, but interestingly, no other shows in 1934. Perhaps someone can comment below if they know more about this. The stamp on this sheet is based on the perforated issue from the year before. This is another of the Farley's Follies issues. You can tell from this page how I had misunderstood what was going on with these stamps. I've labeled this single as Scott 733. If you look carefully at the bottom, you'll see a line along the perfs. That line tells me that this is actually Scott 753, one of those special printings. Let's fix that. Eventually, I'll dig up a real copy of 733 and add it to this page. I also need to find an imperforate single for this page. That's Scott 735A, and a cut line pair to better show the special printing. Oh, and there's also a gutter pair for the special printing of the souvenir sheet, Scott 768A. When I finish this page, there should be the souvenir sheet, 2 singles, and 2 pairs. No wonder I was confused. This sheet was definitely made for the 1934 American Philatelic Society convention. It says so right on the sheet. Like the bird issue, this stamp has 4 different singles. As does this Yosemite issue. It looks so similar to the Mount Rainier souvenir sheet that you'd be forgiven if you thought they came from the same event. I did. This one actually comes from yet a 3rd so-honored stamp show that year. This one, the Trans-Mississippi Philatelic Exposition, was held in Omaha, Nebraska. Don't confuse that show with the Trans-Mississippi Exposition of 1898. That show was actually a World's Fair. This 1934 show was a regional stamp show sponsored by the Omaha Philatelic Society. Like the 2 previous sheets, there were 4 single varieties to collect for this one too. Back to the big show of the American Philatelic Society. This Typex sheet was released for the 3rd International Philatelic Exposition in New York City, the 3rd IPEX, T for 3rd, Typex. The previous IPEX in 1926 had released the White Plains souvenir sheet. The APS tradition, which largely continues to this day, is to hold this huge international show every 10 years, notably in years ending in 6. In 2026, the 12th International Philatelic Exposition will be held in Boston. This sheet is past those Farley special printings, so there are only 4 perforated and imperforated singles associated with it. This is one of my favorites. It's based on the National Park Series stamp of the same design, changing the color from black to this green. I like this green much better. The National Park stamp comes perforated and with the imperforate special printing. There was no Farley special printing for this souvenir sheet though, so distinguishing a single from this sheet and from the earlier imperforate stamp is trivial. Just look at the color difference. Although since this is a small sheet with just 1 stamp, there doesn't seem to be much point in cutting out the single. All the used copies I've seen have come from the full sheet. This sheet was made for the annual convention of the Society of Philatelic Americans. This is not the same thing as the American Philatelic Society. This group started out as the Southern Philatelic Society and seems to have disappeared in 1983. This Cypex sheet is the next in the APS IPEX series, although it didn't come out in a year ending in 6. Instead, that show was delayed to align with the 100th anniversary of the U.S. postage stamp, otherwise known as its centenary, hence the C in Cypex. The next IPEX, FIPEX, the F for 5th, went back to the year ending in a 6 tradition. Obviously have some work to do on all these pages showing the interesting singles. These particular stamps aren't too hard to find. I'm sure I have some duplicate copies. I just need to dig them out and add them. Although I don't think I've ever seen used imperf singles from the souvenir sheet. This Cypex, S for 6th, moved the show to Washington, D.C. As of this show, the venue for the IPEX show has moved to different cities, with Boston getting the honor for the 2026 show. Now we get to something really different. These 4 sheets feature 4 classic paintings of the founding of the U.S. 200 years earlier. They were released in 1976 and have a logo in the bottom corner connecting them to the U.S. Bicentennial celebration. You might be tempted to say that these sheets are not technically souvenirs of anything, but notice the release year, 1976. Notice that the year ends in a 6? Indeed, that was the year of the 7th IPEX, which was held in Philadelphia. That show was known as Interphil. These sheets were released during that show and generally thought of as the souvenir sheet for that show, despite not being explicitly noted as such on the sheet. There was no other souvenir sheet issued during that show. The 4 sheets came in 4 different denominations: 13 cents, which was the letter rate, 18 cent, 24 cent, and 31 cent, which was an airmail rate. It's not clear what the 18 and 24 cent stamps would be useful for. To be generous, 24 cents would have covered postage for an overweight letter. No matter really, as with most souvenir sheets, these were never designed to be used postally. This is the CAPEX sheet. Despite the PEX in the name, this show was not an American Philatelic Society IPEX show. CAPEX stands for Canadian Philatelic Exposition. They dropped the word international from the name, despite it being an international show. The smaller size stamps on this sheet feature animals that live along the US-Canadian border. My wife got me this set. It's from the 1986 Ameripex show, the 8th International Philatelic Exposition by the APS, another year ending in 6. Also note the timing of this set, the mid-80s, the same time that the US postal system started to make collecting more expensive. These 4 sheets have 36 stamps at 22 cents each, a face value of $7.92. This is the most expensive souvenir sheet set in US history up to this point. Compare that to the Bicentennial sheets with a face value of just $4.30. The souvenir sheet from the show before that one, Cypex, only cost 5 cents. This sheet was issued for the World Stamp Expo in 1989. It was held in Washington as part of the 20th Universal Postal Congress. That's the international group responsible for working out issues with international mail service. While this sheet was issued to highlight the stamp show itself, the next 2 sheets were issued to commemorate the UPU meeting hosted in the US for the first time. This sheet shows 4 historical ways of delivering mail: stagecoach, paddleboat, biplane, and an early mail truck. This second sheet shows 4 fanciful thoughts about future mail delivery: the space shuttle, a hovering mail truck, a moon rover, and again the space shuttle delivering mail to the International Space Station. These 2 sheets may be the first time that the US issued something that seems like a souvenir sheet, but the sheets aren't actually a souvenir of anything. Buckle up, it gets bumpy from here. This sheet was issued in 1991 to start a 5-year series commemorating 50 years since World War II. I think it's worth asking exactly what this sheet is philatelically. It's obvious, since I've put it in this album, that I think of it like a souvenir sheet. Some people have suggested that if an item was meant to be saved like a souvenir, then we can reasonably call it a souvenir sheet. That feels fair enough to me. These stamps were meant to be saved by collectors for sure, but they were also meant to be used, despite the large non-postal panel that they're attached to. This sheet feels like a good balance between something meant for the general public in a format that's also interesting for collectors. It's not even that expensive. I really like it, and as far as I'm concerned, this series earns a spot in my souvenir sheet album. I have the first 3 of the series, but I'm missing the last 2. From here on, collecting special sheets like this starts to get more expensive. The Postal Service starts to blur the line between what's best collected as singles and what's best collected as special sheets like this, whether you want to call them souvenir sheets or not. In 1992, these Voyages of Columbus sheets came out, reprinting the 1993 Columbian series. That's 500 years after the 1492 landing, but oddly only 99 years since the Columbian stamps were issued. The total cost of this set was $16.34, exactly the same as the cost of the original series. This could be a money grab, but somehow the cost symmetry makes sense here. Still, that's more than double the cost of the Ameripex President's sheets. Nonetheless, I like these, but I also like the Columbian series. Most stamp collectors do. If you think about the original Columbian series, that was a serious money grab at the time. $16.34 in 1893 was the equivalent of $551.48 today. Back then, there was no practical use for the higher value stamps except perhaps market speculation. It turns out they were a good investment, though, because a mint set of the Columbians would cost you over $10,000 today. On the other hand, adjusted for inflation, the 6 1992 Souvenir Sheets would be worth $35.38, but today they can be bought for under $20 on eBay. That's an investment that didn't even keep up with inflation. You'll see on my page that I have a Spanish version too. I recently found this one in a lot. I didn't even know it existed when I found it. Americans, right? We act like we're the only country in the world. Now back to the collection. This Spanish version only has one stamp on each of its 6 sheets. Each is 60 pesetas. The other stamps are not perforated and don't have a denomination. There are Italian and Portuguese versions of these sheets too. This was a joint release by the 4 countries most closely related to Columbus's voyage. In 1992, the Postal Service started making some changes that hinted at how they were going to move collectors from collecting singles into collecting whole sheets of stamps. They started adding some explanatory text to the salvage of sheets that made those sheets a little more interesting to collectors. Let's take a look at an example here in this 1992 Year of the Rooster sheet. Other than the standard markings, it reads, "Many countries celebrate the new year on the first of the year. Ancient cultures often celebrated the lunar calendar. The lunar calendar in 1993 is symbolized by the rooster. The rooster is the 10th animal in a 12-animal cycle." This extra text doesn't seem to be pushing collectors to collect the sheets, although some people would have. By no means would I consider this a souvenir sheet. I didn't put it in my album. But in 1994, this sheet was released. This sheet has a title section, Legends of American Music Series, and it's formatted more like artwork than explanatory text. I lean towards this not being a souvenir sheet. You probably do too. But honestly, what makes it different than this sheet? The title artwork is more elaborate, but nonetheless, it's still just title artwork, just like the Jazz Singers sheet. You can see this sheet at any stamp show and all over the internet. That's partly because each stamp is different and partly because the post office recalled and re-released this sheet. They had mislabeled Ben Pickett as Bill Pickett and decided to fix the problem, recalling the mislabeled sheets. The publicity from this certainly raised the profile of this sheet. I've included the Legends of the West sheet in my album, but not the Year of the Rooster sheet. I may change my mind in the future. So if we collect the Legends of the West stamps as a sheet, why don't we do the same for the Jazz Singer sheet? And I'm sure you'll say that I've already answered my own question, which might be fair, except that the Legends of the West stamps are part of a 9-sheet series called the Classic Collection. Each of the sheets in this series has the same 20-stamp format, with each stamp being different, and the back of each stamp having a description of the stamp. This Insects and Spiders sheet is part of that series. The title text on this one is hardly even title art, although you could rightly say it is still different from the Jazz Singer sheet because every stamp is different and because it has the descriptions on the back. The Jazz Singer sheet has only 8 unique stamps in a sheet of 35. Fair again, so what about this sheet? Scott goes so far as to label this as a souvenir sheet. This feels more like a souvenir sheet with the smaller size, and each stamp is different, but the title on this one is just as simple as the Jazz Singers sheet. Still, you might argue that each stamp being different is what makes this a souvenir sheet. I'd certainly agree that collecting this as a full sheet makes sense. That's how I'd collect it for sure, but I'd put this one into my commemorative album, not my souvenir sheet album, with all due respect to the Scott catalog. And we certainly can't say that to be a souvenir sheet, all the stamps have to be different. Indeed, many of our classic souvenir sheets have multiple copies of the same stamp. I'm honestly beat on this question. I certainly consider any sheet that was released as part of a stamp show a souvenir sheet. I also am happy to include anything like the World War II sheet that was primarily made for saving rather than postage, something that kind of has some interest all in its own. Other than that, I kind of go through the rest of the sheets that the U.S. Postal Service has put out, and, well, I decide based on my own whim. I tend to say yes to anything that has interesting salvage, that I want to kind of make sure I see the whole sheet, and I kind of say no to things like this Jazz Singer sheet, that has nothing more than a title associated with it. Anyway, let's look at some more stamps. I don't have this World Cup stamp yet. I do have this Norman Rockwell sheet, but I haven't bought them out for it yet. I don't have either the Legends of the West or the error version of that sheet. I don't have this sheet of Bureau of Engraving and Printing stamps featuring James Madison. I should point out, though, that all 4 of the stamps on this sheet are the same, and yet I still have a spot for it in this album. I do have this sheet, and I'm showing it to you to point out an oddity. Yes, I did make a space for it in my album. I'm not even sure how I came to own this stamp. I think by rights it doesn't really belong here. There are a number of other sheets which are similar, all 1 stamp, a 20 stamp sheet. Selvage isn't notably integrated with the stamps. When I saw how many of them there were, I decided against adding the rest. I'll probably take this out of this album someday. You'll notice a few blank pages and some that are filled in. In some cases I have the sheet, but not the mount yet. Moving to this sheet from 1997, you might be wondering where our 1996 IPEX souvenir sheet went. Actually, the IPEX was delayed by a year to align with the 150th anniversary of the first U.S. postage stamps. The 1997 IPEX was called Pacific 97 and held in San Francisco, and this sheet is not actually the souvenir sheet for that show. This is the first U.S. triangular stamp labeled Pacific 97 on each stamp. Notice the wording on the selvage is reminiscent of the way the White Plains souvenir sheet was labeled. While not technically the souvenir sheet for that show, this sheet belongs in this album as far as I'm concerned. This Franklin sheet and the next one, this Washington sheet, were the souvenir sheets for that show, although the Scott catalog does not list any of these 3 as the souvenir sheet. Indeed, Scott doesn't even show a picture of any of these sheets, just the stamps. They are rather uninspired designs in my opinion, who can blame them? These sheets invoke the 1947 Cypex souvenir sheets, both sets in honor of the first U.S. postage stamps. As far as I'm concerned, this dinosaur sheet is a mistake. Don't get me wrong, I like both panels independently, and I appreciate the effort of the postal system to make stamps that appeal to young collectors. But this should really be 2 sheets, and made slightly narrower to fit on the album better. Look how I've mounted it. One edge is aligned to the edge of the page, and the other overlaps with the hole punch. This would even be a tight fit in my Minuteman album. Oh well, at least we don't see anything this size again. This is another great attempt at pulling kids into collecting. Also not really a souvenir sheet, but I'm okay with it here. There were 5 different Looney Tunes sheets like this one. I just have this one, although I have a different one on cover. This Bugs version also came in another version called the die cut error, but I think of it as a choice more than an error. Sheets like this were made with the die cuts on the left going all the way through the paper backing to make it easier to sell stamp singles. On those sheets, the stamp on the right was not die cut through at all. In fact, when the post office had sold all the singles from a sheet, they would destroy the right side as salvage. There are only 118,000 of these quote-unquote die-cut error stamps, making them quite expensive to get a hold of. The postal system made similar die-cut error sheets for the other stamps in this series, this time making enough to satisfy collector demand. Interestingly, the final sheet featuring Porky Pig has a hidden message with his catchphrase, "That's all, folks," that is revealed on the backing paper when all the stamps are used. That sign-off signals not only the end of the sheet, but also the end of the Looney Tunes stamp series as a whole. I'm tempted to buy one and use the stamps just to have that message in my collection. I couldn't find a picture of that online. If any of you have one, please share an image with us. Let's stop here for a minute. This series of 10 sheets came out starting in 1998. Each has 15 different stamps highlighting an element of the featured decade. The whole series has a face value of $48. After a number of sheets which seem designed to appeal to younger collectors, this seems quite out of place. To make it worse, when you see these stamps as singles, they look strange and have no unifying design elements. Some are notably cool and others are just junky. That's a lot of stamps. You can see I haven't filled out all the sheets in this section. The next notable series is the Nature of America set. This is the second in a series of 12 sheets. I have 4 of them. I do love these sheets, despite this one spelling out rainforest as 2 words. They seem geared again to young collectors. Actually, they seem geared to grandparents wanting to give an educational gift to their grandchildren, but I do think kids would like these sheets. This is where my album stops. You'll notice that I do have a page for the insects and spiders stamps. A shout out to the postal system for continuing to try to attract young collectors. We certainly need that. I have a few more sheets that I need to make pages for. This is actually a souvenir sheet from the 2001 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. This one only has 4 different stamps, but I'll make a page for it because I'm a huge Disney fan and I like it. And I'll give a nod to the postal system again for catering to kids. I'm also a bit of a film buff. This one at least has a creative design and I already have the mount for it. This Star Wars sheet is wonderful. Much better than the Star Wars droid stamps they issued in 2021 to mark the 50th anniversary of Lucasfilms. And finally, I have 2 of these Civil War sheets, part of a series of 5. I like them, but I think I'm going to need 2 copies of each because they are meaningfully two-sided. I hope you've enjoyed looking over my souvenir sheets with me. I'd appreciate it if you'd like and subscribe to this video. I also really appreciate the comments, and in particular, I'm interested in comments about how you feel about the length of the videos that I've made so far. That'll help me tune that to what you most want to see. I have a big job ahead of me. As I look at what I want to add to this particular album, I'm going to have to look through the catalog and look at websites and make a whole new set of sheets. Certainly, I'm going to add a new page for the 2006 IPEX and the 2016 IPEX, and hopefully I'll get that done before the Boston show in 2026 shows up. Anyway, if I learn anything while I'm adding to this album, I'll certainly come back and make another video about this.